The lecturer is Dr. Michael K. Salemi. Professor Salemi is Professor of Economics and Chair of the Department of Economics at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Recognized at both the university and national levels for his outstanding teaching, he has also delivered seminars on monetary policy to political leaders in emerging Asian economies. He received the Bauer Medal in Economic Education from the Council for Economic Education and the Villard Award for Research in Economic Education from the National Association of Economic Educators.
Hello, and thank you for joining me. I have been fascinated by money since the beginning of my career as an economist. I know what you are thinking. We all like money, and most of us believe we should have more. But what interests me is not the question of my income or yours. What fascinates me is money as a social institution. Money as an agreement among individuals. Money as a collective contract that, if we keep it, makes our economic life much better and allows our economies to grow more rapidly. This course is about that contract and about what it means to keep it. The contract called money is important. As important to our modern society as the invention of the wheel. I will say that again. Money is as important to our modern society as the invention of the wheel. Thus, this course considers issues that are of fundamental importance to our lives and our well-being. In the very last lecture, we will consider challenges that face our monetary and financial institutions in the coming years. I believe, and I think you will come to believe, that rising to these challenges is extremely important. Of course, there is a lot to learn before we can consider these challenges. You will remember that the nation's attempts to recover from the subprime mortgage crisis and the Great Recession were often discussed using the metaphor Wall Street versus Main Street. That phrase, Wall Street versus Main Street, evokes for me a drama of the sort written by John Steinbeck. Let's see, with Henry Fonda playing the role of the common man and Lionel Barrymore playing the greedy capitalist. In that drama, it's every man versus the plutocrats. On October 3rd, 2008, as the subprime mortgage crisis was going from bad to worse, and as the Great Recession was showing itself to be far more damaging than any typical downturn we'd experienced in recent decades, Congress enacted the Emergency Economic Stabilization Act of 2008. That act created the Troubled Asset Relief Program, TARP, Troubled Asset Relief Program, which provided funds for the bailout of financial firms that were in trouble. In September 2008, Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke and Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson had testified on Capitol Hill in favor of the Emergency Stabilization Act and the TARP Fund. Congress voted in favor of the act, and President Bush signed it. Over the coming months, the Fed and the Treasury used TARP funds aggressively to keep banks and non-bank financial firms from failing. But at the same time that funds were flowing to help threatened financial firms, there was a populist outcry. That outcry said that the federal government should do more for Main Street, for the workers and the firms that were suffering at the hands of the Great Recession, and less for Main Street, for the banks and financial institutions and their management. During his campaign, President Barack Obama condemned, I quote, greedy CEOs who are taking too much risk. Although, as president, he continued to support both the Treasury and the Fed initiatives to rescue the financial sector. Nevertheless, throughout the time of the Great Recession, one frequently heard the view that the federal government supplied too much assistance to the financial sector and too little to the common man. If the government can help those big banks, they can help me keep my home. If there is one idea I hope you will take away from this course, and I hope it fervently, it is that the Wall Street versus Main Street idiom is inherently flawed. Oh, sure. At any given time, if the federal government gave fewer dollars to help commercial banks, it would have more dollars to help the unemployed. But that very narrow truth misses a much larger and much more important truth. The success of Main Street and the success of Wall Street are inextricably bound together. Main Street cannot win without Wall Street, and Wall Street cannot win without Main Street. The most important point that we will encounter in this course is that economies require efficient and ever-evolving financial institutions and markets in order to maximize their potential. We will encounter this idea many times in different ways and guises and in different contexts. In this first lecture, I would like to provide a preview of the ways in which we will come to understand the connection between financial matters and economic well-being, the interconnectedness of Main Street and Wall Street. For the sake of specificity, I will give you 4 reasons why the fates of Main Street and Wall Street are intertwined. The first reason: stable value money is essential to efficient trade. Famous quote: "It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. We address ourselves not to their humanity, but to their self-love, and never talk to them of our own necessities, but of their advantages." That very famous quote, those words are from perhaps the most famous economist of all time, and from that economist's most famous book, the man Adam Smith, the book The Wealth of Nations. The quote goes to the heart of Smith's argument that a nation becomes wealthy when it organizes its productive efforts to take advantage of specialization. But Smith warns us, specialization is an inherently social activity. Producing lots of excellent beer, great quantities of tremendously good bread, or the best beef in your village will make sense only if we can trade a lot of it for other things that we want but that we do not produce. So, Smith teaches trade is essential to wealth creation and to the improvement of the quality of life. But Smith goes further. He warns again that trade can only be accomplished efficiently in a society that has adopted money. While I'll take this point up in great detail in coming lectures, the following story captures much of what is true about the importance of stable value money for trade, that creator of wealth. I love stories. I hope you like this one. Suppose you were a homesteader in the first half of the 19th century in some place like Kansas or Missouri. You engaged in subsistence farming, but despite your great ingenuity, you could not provide for all of your needs. So, occasionally, you took the days required to travel to a town and purchase what you needed. But how would you pay? Let's say that you brought some wool from your sheep with you to market, and your first stop was at the shop of a garment maker who had bought wool from you in the past. You're in luck. The garment maker will again buy your wool. You agree upon a price, and then are presented with banknotes drawn on a bank in Illinois. Immediately you wonder, are the notes any good? Will the owner of the general store accept them when I visit him tomorrow? And if not, will they keep their value until I find someone who is willing to accept them? Now, suffice it to say that your concerns are extremely legitimate, and they represent an impediment to trade. Your sheep may produce the finest wool in the territory. The garment maker may agree that your wool is without equal in quality, but that will be cold comfort to you and cold comfort to the garment maker if you find it a risky proposition to sell that wool. In this course, we will come to understand that money is a social contract, and we will study the evolution of that monetary contract from very early times, when money was typically a portable, highly used commodity. And we'll continue that study to modern times when money is, let's face it, intrinsically worthless paper currency, or in many cases, balances in electronic record books. My second point for you. Healthy banks are essential to the process of channeling funds from savers to investors. Let's stay with our example of homesteading on the Great Plains. Some years have passed now, and you have neighbors with whom you cooperate and socialize. At one of your gatherings, one of you mentions that it would be a great enhancement to your productivity if each of you had a windmill to pump water from the wells you have dug. But there's a problem. None of you has the funds necessary to purchase the pipe or the moving parts required. Each of you saves something each year for a rainy day, but none has enough to order the necessary from back east. After talking for a while, you realize that collective action is possible. You realize that if you pool your funds with your neighbors, one windmill could be built immediately. You and your neighbors have just decided to create a bank. At its core, a bank is an institution that channels funds from savers, those who save from their income in order to spend more than their income at a later time, to investors, windmill builders, those who wish to build productive equipment and buildings, which economists refer to as capital. Channeling funds from savers to investors is fundamental to economic growth. If those with productive ideas had to wait until they accumulated sufficient funds from their own saving before they acted on their ideas, little growth would occur. Channeling funds from savers to investors is mutually beneficial. Savers earn interest on their savings. Investors gain the opportunity to enact their ideas sooner rather than later. You and your homesteader neighbors will come to learn that your decision to pool funds so that one of you can build a windmill sooner is not without its challenges. How will you decide which neighbor builds? How will you decide how much interest to charge? How will you ensure that the borrower will repay? In modern economies, many of these problems are solved by financial institutions such as banks and the markets for credit in which they operate. Efficient asset markets are essential to establishing values for debt instruments like bonds, currencies, and shares of stock. Financial markets are essential. So, remember our original homesteader problem. Our homesteader was offered payment for wool in the form of a paper banknote drawn on a bank in Illinois. One way to express the problem that our homesteader faced is to say that the homesteader did not know the value of that banknote in terms of some widely accepted payment medium, let's say gold. Knowing the value of things is very, very important, even when those things are financial instruments. One of the key reasons for the subprime mortgage crisis that led to TARP and certainly contributed to the depth of the Great Recession was the simple fact that banks held large quantities of mortgage-backed securities. Of course, it was a problem that those securities lost value once house prices began to fall in 2007. But an even bigger problem was that banks and potential lenders to banks had no way of determining the value of those mortgage-backed securities once the housing crisis began. Why? Because there was no market in which those securities were traded. The value wasn't the face value, and the value wasn't zero. Part of the job of markets would be to find out or discover what the value was. Markets play essential roles in the functioning of our financial system. Bond markets provide a way for large and well-known businesses to obtain investment funds, funds to build their firms. Markets price financial securities so that borrowers and lenders and financial institutions know what those securities are worth. Contrast for a moment our homesteader's currency problem with what you might consider to be a similar problem today. Suppose you are traveling to Europe. Doesn't have to be France or Italy or Germany, Czech Republic, for example. Well, you know that you will need either euros or some other foreign currency to buy what you want to buy. But you do not have to guess the value of the euro. You do not have to guess the value of the Czech currency because many billions of euros are exchanged for dollars in foreign currency markets every day. Indeed, many, many billions of financial currency units are traded every day for dollars, not just euros. We will study financial markets, bond markets, stock markets, and currency markets in detail in this course. We will come to understand what is traded in those markets, how to think about the prices that those markets set, and why those markets play an essential role in a modern economy such as ours. We will also come to understand the connection between those markets and important financial institutions, such as the United States Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, and the People's Bank of China. I promised you 4 reasons. Here is number 4. A well-designed and well-executed monetary policy is essential for an economy to keep inflation low and steady and to keep resources fully employed. Modern economies need well-crafted monetary policies. Here we have to leave our homesteader metaphor behind us. It makes no sense to talk about monetary policy in the first half of the 19th century. Why, you might ask? We had no monetary policy then. It's true that our nation made decisions about money and banks in the 19th century, and we will cover some of those decisions in our lectures. But monetary policy, as we think of it today, began with the creation of the Federal Reserve System in 1914. In fact, the requirement that the Fed promote low and steady inflation as well as full employment of our resources is an even more recent development, as we shall learn. But what is a well-designed and well-executed monetary policy? There's a great deal of disagreement about how to answer that question, even among economists. We will learn how the Federal Reserve changes interest rates in order to pursue its policy objectives. We will learn that sometimes, as in the years of the Great Recession, the Fed does even more. It lends directly to financial firms, and we will learn why this is so. In 2014, the Federal Reserve will celebrate its 100th anniversary. Some economists and politicians believe that the best thing we could do on that anniversary would be to eliminate or greatly change the Fed. They argue that the Fed wields too much power. They point to steps taken by the Fed during the Great Recession as evidence of that power. And they are angered by the Fed's bailout of financial firms during that period. Put another way, some critics hold that the Fed did too much for Wall Street and too little for Main Street. Some critics go so far as to suggest we'd be better off returning to the gold standard. Others believe that the Fed has learned a lot about the proper conduct of monetary policy during its first 100 years. They argue that Fed policy under Volcker, Greenspan, and Bernanke, that's Paul Volcker, Alan Greenspan, and Ben Bernanke, has done an excellent job of conquering inflation in the United States, and we will take a look at the evidence that supports that view. But even those who are Federal Reserve champions would like to see the Fed revise and fine-tune its operations. Some believe that the Fed should set a more explicit inflation target, like that set from time to time by the Federal Reserve Bank of New Zealand. Ask yourself the question, do you know what the target rate of inflation is? Of course you don't. The Federal Reserve does not announce one. Some believe that the Federal Reserve has yet to find a way around the terrible incentives created by bailing out failing banks. And my goodness, we will talk about those incentives in great detail. Those who look for improvement in this particular area are less motivated by the Wall Street-Main Street distinction and more motivated by the concern that the Federal Reserve creates terrible incentives when it bails out a failing bank. Economists call this problem the too big to fail problem, and we will study too big to fail also in some detail in this course. Let's talk for a moment about powerful individuals. And for the sake of argument, let me concede that the President of the United States is the most powerful single individual in the world. Who, in your view, is the second most powerful person in the world? Take a moment to think and write down your view. Or if you're watching with someone else now, take a moment and exchange your views. Have you done it? Okay. Permit me to share my humble opinion with you. The second most powerful person in the world is not a president, is not a general, is not an admiral, does not hold a cabinet post in our government or in another, and is not even elected. The second most powerful person in the world is Ben Bernanke, the chairman of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. But why is Bernanke so powerful? A substantial portion of this course will be devoted to understanding central banks and central bankers, not only in the United States, but also in the United Kingdom, in the European area, the Euro area, in China, and in other developed nations. We will come to understand why central banks and central bankers are entrusted with the job of making sure our money retains its value. We will come to understand that it is the central bankers of the world that we hold responsible for keeping our monetary contract intact. We will come to understand that it is the central bankers in the world in whom we place the trust to keep this great invention working well. In this context, we will ask and answer several questions. What threatens the value of money? Many of you will say inflation, but if I asked you why, what would you say? Why, more basically, is it important to preserve the value of money? These are pieces of paper, after all. How can a central banker preserve the value of money? What can a central bank do to preserve that value? And very, very importantly, if we have a central bank that is committed to preserving the value of our money, is committed to keeping that social contract functioning well, is that all it can do? Or is there room for it to do more? Return again, please, for a moment to the Main Street versus Wall Street theme we encountered earlier. Were the Stabilization Act of 2008, the TARP Fund, and the way that our Treasury and the Federal Reserve use that fund essential to the Federal Reserve's job of preserving the value of the U.S. dollar? If you say yes, you should understand why. If you say no, you should likewise understand why. Is it the case that Ben Bernanke, a non-elected individual, should somehow come more directly under the control of the voters? Or is there wisdom in allowing Ben Bernanke and the Federal Reserve latitude to pursue its policy? Part of this course is dedicated to answering all of these questions, and I look forward to the journey with you. Until next time, I wish you a very good day.